will never forget the day I decided to paint in watercolor. I only had watercolor pencils from my daughter's school, and I used that, and then I found this old palette, which is also a palette they use in school, and this is how I just practiced for that day until I could get to the art store to buy myself a few different art supplies. And this is how this whole journey of mine started with watercolor paint, was with this very cheap set of watercolor paint. Of course, this is not the best quality, but it was adequate for what I wanted to do on that first day, and just to learn a few basics in watercolor. And then obviously the watercolor pencils, and you will see there's a little brush on some of the pencils, which shows you that these are watercolor pencils. And then I went to the art store and I bought this little Cotman's watercolor set, which is from Winsor & Newton. This is perfect if you are a beginner in watercolor. Also, before you spend a lot of money on watercolor, I will highly recommend you buy a reasonably good brand, but not the most expensive, because you might not paint forever. You might not like painting in watercolor, but this little brand is very, very beautiful, and I know a lot of botanical artists that use this brand of watercolor paint. And then that's a little set that when we travel, I take this with me to paint. And then this was my first watercolor set when I realized I definitely want to paint in watercolor. So this is a very good brand. It's White Nights, and you have all the colors that you need on this palette. It was quite pricey when I bought this set, but that was when I realized I definitely want to paint in watercolor. So you can buy smaller little sets of palettes to suit your needs, and I made a little color chart for me. It's just easier when you use your watercolor paint. But this is basically what you need. You can buy a few tubes, and like I said, this is a different brand, the same as this, Cotman's watercolors. And what you do is you just use a little palette. This is a little plastic palette that you can use, or you can use a plate, or you can use one of these plates that you have in the kitchen. And with watercolor tubes, what you have to do is you open that, obviously you open the tube, and you can just put a little bit of your paint on your palette. To use a tube of watercolor paint, you can use whichever brand you prefer. These are very reasonably priced. They're Cotman's watercolor. They're very, very good. Obviously this is artist quality, so they're professional watercolor paints, and they're from Winsor & Newton. You get all different brands from Daniel Smith, Core Watercolors, and Sennelier, and there's a whole host of other brands that you can choose from to paint in watercolor. So how we use this tube of watercolor, we've got clean water in a glass. So to activate this, you need a watercolor brush and some clean water, and you dip your brush in a little bit of water. So let me just move this up. So you dip your brush in a bit of water, and you just move it over the paint. Now this is if you want to paint start very quickly. A lot of artists squirt some paint out on the plate and they leave it to dry, but I'm now going to paint and I want to use this immediately. You can do whichever way you prefer. You can either let it dry on your plate, or you can use it immediately. And this is how you activate your paint. So you wet it. Now you can paint. Let's get a piece of paper. We have a piece of scrap paper, and I'm going to wet this and then pick it up with my brush and just move it over the paper. And that's how you start to paint in watercolor, or use a tube of watercolor. Now, to use the paint on your palette, you do the same thing. You can either use a little spray bottle, water bottle, where you can wet the paint and start activating into use, or you can just dip your brush in water and then lift up some of your paint and then use it on your paper. As easy as that. I have 2 glasses of water always ready for my watercolor paints, because when if you can look at this, I just dip my brush in there. This is what watercolor pigment does to your water. It colors it. So I always have 2 glasses of water, one to dip my brush in when I use a very pigmented watercolor, and the other just to clean my brush with clean water. And then this is how you use your watercolor paints. These are the palettes already hardened in a palette that you just activated, and then these are from your tube that you squirted out on a plate. You also get liquid watercolor paints, which I will show you right now, but initially you don't want to get confused. You want to just use the basics. This is how you start in watercolor, with either tubes, a palette, or watercolor pencils. You'll also see it will say aqua color. You can make little markings on your paper, and then you can just activate it with the brush that you dip in water. So you just dip your brush in water and you can activate this color on my brush, but this is how you activate your color pencils. Which is very interesting to use in watercolor. Let me just find another color, and you can go thick, thin, clean water, and you just wet it with your brush. And that's why I say you always have to have clean water with you, because you can see I have a little bit of this red pigment on my brush still. And this is how you use your watercolor crayons or pencils, and your palette and your tubes. I will share a bit more of what I use in watercolor. I do have a video of all my watercolor supplies. I will share it with you guys. But obviously, if you just want to start out in watercolor, you don't need a lot. You just need some brushes, some clean water, a palette or tubes, or watercolor crayons. So the other watercolor liquids that I spoke about earlier is this brand Dr. P.H. Martin. It is fine art watercolors. They are very, very vibrant, beautiful. They're blendable, intermixable, high density, brilliant, permanent pigments, transparent and light fast. And I buy only the colors that I use most of the time. I didn't buy the whole set. I have a few colors that I prefer to use, and you will do the same. When you paint in watercolor, you will find that you prefer certain colors and certain brands, which is perfectly fine. Everyone have their own preference to watercolors and what they like. Same with watercolor paper. I can just guide you and tell you what I like, but in the end you will find out what you prefer and what you like to paint with. So this is the watercolor liquid that I spoke about earlier, and I use this a lot in my Patreon online school and for my roses. And what you do is you can just mix it, because a lot of the pigment's stuck at the bottom if it stands for quite some time, and then you just you can see I've used quite a lot, but it lasts very, very long. This is quite old already. You just drop a little bit of the pigment on your palette or plate or whatever you prefer to paint on, and then you can either use it directly from the palette and then dilute it with clean water. I will do it very quickly. I won't leave it for too long to set, because it stains the paper. So you won't be, if you look at that little pot, just by leaving it too long, it stains the paper. It's very staining pigment, but absolutely beautiful and vibrant. Or you can just take water on your brush and activate it again on your palette, and then just use it like this. Alternatively, you can obviously wet your paper with clean water. I just have some pigment on my brush and leave it to soak in a little bit, and then just drop in your pigment. And this is beautiful watercolors, and like I said, I've ordered only the colors that I use most of the time. I find that the whole set, I will not use all those colors on this that's in the set that they provide. I will waste all of it. I will have to give it away, because I only use certain colors that I prefer in this liquid watercolors. So that's it, all the watercolors and everything you need to know so far. And we will do a few more of these little watercolor videos where I will teach you what to do and what to use and what I prefer to use if you just start out in watercolors. Bockingford watercolor paper, and I recently did that onion on Patreon and on YouTube on this paper. It is beautiful paper to paint on, not expensive, very reasonable. And if you want to learn how to paint in watercolor, these spiral books are very, very lovely to use. I have a color chart there at the back where I've mixed all my colors as well. I'm busy making a massive color chart for myself, and these little spiral books are amazing because you can always go back and at a later stage look at what you've learned and how far you've come. Obviously, my favorite watercolor paper is Artist Watercolor, which is 300 grams paper. So it's a whole sheet that you cut, and then you stretch your watercolor paper on a piece of wood or glass or perspex, and I then just straighten them in this folder. I never throw these folders away. I always use these folders. This is a new brand of watercolor paper that I want to try. It's cold pressed, and this is what I mean about a block. So it's glued. It's glued on all sides, so it can't move. And then once you finish, you just slide a knife in this edge here, and you lift it up and you remove your painting. So there are quite a lot of good brands of watercolor. Fabriano is a good brand. There are many good brands of watercolor paper, but don't go for the cheapest watercolor paper. I've bought paper before where there's a blue tinge to the paper. So I'm not going to share the brand of watercolor paper, but this is very cheap watercolor paper. And this was a book that I bought when I just started in watercolor paint, and there's quite a few left of them. I absolutely thought it was good paper, but it is not. When the minute I started to paint on real better quality real Artist watercolor paper or Fabriano watercolor paper, or even Bockingford, or there are so many different good brands of watercolor paper that you can paint on. I was shocked to realize that I bought this rubbish paper, and you know, it makes a difference to your paintings. It honestly makes a difference to your painting. So if you can see, I don't know if you can see, there's a blue tinge to this paper, and this is like a off-white, but amazing. So there's definitely a blue tinge to this paper. It really looks like recycled paper, and I don't like it. I really don't like it. It's also not, it absorbs, the paint immediately soaks into the paper, which it's supposed to do, but I just don't like, I don't like the paper. I don't know why. I just don't like it. Honestly, if you want to learn and if you are serious about watercolor paper, I would highly recommend just buy a little bit more expensive than the cheapest brand of watercolor paper. It will make a huge difference in your art. So just a quick recap. If you want to learn how to paint in watercolor, you need a palette, a watercolor palette, or tubes, and a plate. Now, even if you have a palette, I always mix my colors on a plate, a cheap little plate. You don't need a very expensive plate. You can use something that you have in the kitchen. You can also buy one of these eventually. They are lovely little porcelain little plates, but any plate that you have in your kitchen, even a tiny little round one, will do. Obviously you need pencil and eraser, and you need some watercolor brushes. You can either use synthetic or sable hair brushes or natural hair brushes. Also, this is basically, I would say, not even 40 rand. This one is a bit more expensive. And then you obviously need tubes of watercolor paint, any brand. If you prefer to use tubes, you can buy tubes and you need a plate to mix it on, or you can use your palette. And then of course you need water, clean water, and you need watercolor paper, any brand, but a good quality brand. Obviously if you learn, I will go for the more reasonably priced watercolor papers, and if you're serious about watercolor paint, I will move on to more expensive brands. There are loads on the market, very good brands of watercolor paper, but it makes a huge difference to your watercolor art. I will not use cheap paper to paint on ever again in my life. I'm spoiled with these beautiful colors. And then you can create all of these beautiful paintings. I'm working on this one now for Patreon, and this is what I mean by good watercolor paper. Just want to move this wire out the way. It makes a huge difference to your paintings. This is all just watercolor paper, and Fabriano is amazing, Barkingford's amazing. There are so many good brands of watercolor paper that you can use. I'm just hooked on two brands that I prefer at the moment, but I'm going to try this other brand that I bought recently. And yes, that's what you need to paint in watercolor. So don't go out and buy the most expensive brands yet. First see if you're going to love watercolor, and then from there you move on to more expensive paint and more expensive watercolor brushes like these, and you'll be hooked on watercolor. I have a lovely palette that I use. Just want to get that quickly. I have quite a few, and if you start to paint in watercolor, just want to pack this away, you might do the same and try out different brands. But I have this very cheap plastic palette that most art stores sell, and I mix my colors on there. I also write down the names because I've got quite a lot of colors on here, so if we travel I take this one with me because I need all my colors with me. And these are very, very nice colors to use, little palettes to use. Plastic, mine's quite rough already, so I've used it quite a lot. You can scrub it a little bit with just this kitchen sponge to, you know, the little scrubbing side of this kitchen sponge, because then it makes this a little bit more porous, and then your watercolor doesn't flow all over the place. I also have this one which seals with a lid and keep all the dust away, which is amazing as well. And as you can see, I use this very often. I love these plastic palettes, and you can just seal it if you're finished, because all the dust collects on your paint. That's the other thing with these little, if you store all your paint or all your paint on here, you have to cover this when you're done so that it doesn't collect a lot of dust on it, because you don't want any dust on your paintings. It's very difficult to paint if you have a very dusty palette. Just want to cover this. And then this is my recent one that I bought, which I'm busy filling up now. And then I just write the names with a permanent marker there. And these are all my favorite colors I'm starting to mix in this palette. So yes, there are very different watercolor palettes. You will find the best one that suits you.